Dr. Sage here. In this series of 3 video lectures, we're going to talk about phylogenies and the history of life. In this first video, we're going to talk about how we organize or classify the life on this planet. By the end of this video, you should be able to discuss the components and purpose of a phylogenetic tree, list the different levels of the Linnaean classification system, derive or interpret relationships based upon the phylogenetic tree, and demonstrate comprehension of the binomial nomenclature. So, we have an enormous amount of diversity of life on this planet, but there's also a lot of unity within that diversity. For example, all organisms share many characteristics, such as all living things are made out of one or more than one cell. They carry out metabolism, they transfer energy using ATP, and they encode hereditary information in their DNA. All that material you learned in Bio 1. On this planet, we've identified about 1.5 million species. We estimate there's about 5 million species currently alive on this planet, and about 100 billion to 1 trillion individual organisms living on this planet. Biologists group organisms based on shared characteristics. This information comes from the fossil record, morphology, physiology, behavior, embryonic development, and DNA and RNA sequences. How do we organize the information about the different types of organisms living on this planet? Well, we do that using a phylogenetic tree, also known as an evolutionary tree. This is a hypothesis about relationships among the different taxonomic groups. You can kind of think of this like a family tree for the different organisms living on this planet. And there's different types of phylogenetic trees. You can have a rooted tree. Okay, that's where you have a single lineage starting at the base of the tree, and that represents the common ancestor of everything that's coming from that. Or you can have an unrooted phylogenetic tree. It shows relationships among the different organisms, but not the common ancestor. All right, so how do you read a phylogenetic tree? And some terms that go along with it. Okay, first term, a taxon, or taxa, the plural version. These are groups of organisms. Either species, family, domain, etc. For example, E would be a taxon, okay, or D would be a taxon. Clade is any branch or lineage. Okay, so we have a clade here. That's an example. Branch points, also known as nodes, is splitting that represents a single lineage evolving into 2 clades. For example, we have a branch point right here, and that's splitting into these 2 different clades. Nodes are the most recent common ancestor of subsequent clades. Taxa that share a node share common ancestors, but they did not evolve from each other. They evolved from a common ancestor at some point in the past. Okay, so for example, let's say these are species. Okay, species A, B, C, and D have a common ancestor they all evolved from, and that would be this branch point here, this node. That would be the common ancestor that all of these evolved from. That would be for A, B, C, and D. Now, if you want for A, B, C, D, and E, you have to go farther back in evolutionary history. Instead of it being here, it's back here. Okay, and that would be the most recent common ancestor of all of those species. We call a lineage that evolved early from the root that remains unbranched, a basal taxon. So this would be the basal taxon here. It emerged early in evolutionary history from the rest of the organisms, and it remains unbranched. We call 2 lineages stemming from the same branch point sister taxa. Okay, so these 2 would be sister taxa. A branch with more than 2 lineages is called a polytomy and serves to illustrate when scientists have not definitively determined all of the relationships. In other words, let's say this is organism A, B, C, and D. Okay, you know those organisms evolved from a common ancestor, but you don't know the order that they evolved. You don't know if A and B are more closely related to each other, or if A and C are more closely related to each other. Okay, we haven't figured out that detail yet. That's called a polytomy. Okay, here's another representation of phylogenetic tree. Now, you can see the phylogenetic trees can be depicted in different ways. In this example, the root of the tree is here. This is early in evolutionary history, and as you progress, you're becoming farther and farther progressed through the timeline. In contrast, this would be early in evolutionary history, and as you progress towards the right, you're coming closer to modern time. Okay, so one way of organizing this evolutionary tree is based upon characteristics that the organisms have. For example, if you look at all these organisms, the lancet does not have a vertebral column. However, the rest of them do. Then getting more specific, the lamprey does not have a hinged jaw, but the rest of these do have a hinged jaw. Getting more specific, fish do not have legs, but all of these organisms do have legs. So you can use evolutionary tree to compare different derived characteristics those organisms have. Like, for example, do they have legs or do they not have legs? Now, of note, the length of the lines does not usually depict an actual amount of time that has passed, unless there's like a scale down here with a timeline on it. You cannot say the amount of absolute time that has passed based on the length of these lines. Often, closely related taxa might look similar to each other, but that's not always necessarily true. If those organisms evolved under different circumstances, so different selective pressure, the taxa may look very different. For example, on this phylogenetic tree, rabbits and lizards are closely related to each other. And both of these are more closely related to each other than they are to frogs. Even though lizards and frogs might look more similar to each other, that doesn't necessarily mean they're more closely related to each other. Actually, the rabbit and the lizard are more closely related than the lizard and the frog. But since rabbits and lizards evolved under different selective pressures, they look very divergent from each other. Okay, so once we identify a species, we want to classify it to understand it. And one way of doing that is through taxonomy. Okay, we use a Linnaean system named after Carl Linnaeus, who came up with this system. And it goes through a series of broader and broader groups to classify that organism. For example, let's say we're talking about your dog you have in your house. Okay, that's subspecies Canis lupus familiaris. That's the name of the domesticated dog. Okay, that's of the species Canis lupus, and then the genus Canis, that's in the family, order, class, phylum, kingdom, domain. What we're doing is we're getting to broader and broader groups. So if we start here at the domain, as we go up this taxonomic tree, each one becomes more and more specific. Each sublevel in the taxonomic classification system, organisms become more similar to each other. For example, dogs and wolves are actually the same species because they can breed together and produce viable offspring, but they're different enough to be classified as different subspecies. Another way of depicting this. Okay, the broadest category is called the domain. The most specific category is typically the species, or it could be subspecies in this example. And this example is depicting your family dog. But just for a second, let's not talk about a dog. Instead, let's talk about a Mustang. And I don't mean the horse, I mean the car. So a Mustang is, let's say Mustang, is a type of Ford. Mustang is a type of Ford. But there are other types of Fords besides Mustangs, like you could have an Escort. Now, Ford is a type of car, and there are other types of cars besides Fords. Besides Fords, you could have, let's say, a Hyundai. And then car is a type of automobile. Besides cars, you could have other things like trucks or vans. An automobile is a type of transportation. Okay, besides automobiles, you could have a train or a plane or a boat. There's different types of transportation. So what we're doing is we're classifying that thing, the Ford Mustang, into broader and broader categories. A Mustang is a type of Ford, which is a type of car, which is a type of automobile, which is a type of transportation. Okay, we can do the same thing with the living organisms on this planet. And that's what taxonomy is, classifying these organisms into broader and broader categories. The broadest category is called the domain. There's 3 domains of life on this planet. Everything living on this planet fits into 1 of 3 domains. That's the domain Eukarya, bacteria, and archaea. And we're going to learn about the different organisms in those domains throughout the rest of this semester. Okay, the domain Eukarya, those are things you're very familiar with. Things like animals and plants and fungus, which is not a plant, and protists, you probably haven't really heard much of before, but we're going to learn a little bit about in this class. The dog is in the domain Eukarya. More specifically, it's an animal. Now, by knowing it's an animal, you already know a lot about it. You know it's an animal, it's not a plant. Okay, because animals and plants are very different from each other. So it's a eukaryote, it's an animal, it has a spinal column, it's a mammal, it's a carnivore, etc. Okay, you get more and more specific until you have the species, or in this case, the subspecies, the actual domesticated dog. This species is given a name, okay, and that's its scientific name. In this case, it's called Canis lupus. Everything we've identified we've given a scientific name to. And the scientific name is always a two-name system, okay, which is the genus, in this case Canis, okay, so that's genus, followed by the specific epithet, okay, in this case lupus. All right, so I'm going to explain that in a little more detail. The species name is the genus plus the specific epithet. When you write this, is a very specific way you write it. The genus is always capitalized. The first letter is capitalized. And the entire species name, so the genus plus the specific epithet, is always written in italics. Unless you're writing by hand, you can't write in italics. In that case, you underline it. For example, our species, were called Homo sapiens. Our genus is Homo, our specific epithet is sapiens. You would write it like this, capital H, the genus, lowercase s, the specific epithet, and put it in italics. Or in the case of the domestic dog, Canis, genus, lupus, specific epithet, and then the subspecies familiaris. Now the higher taxonomic names are capitalized but not italicized. Okay, so for example, here, this is in italics, okay, but these other ones are capitalized but they're not written in italics. So that's the end of this first video, where we talked about taxonomy and how we classify organisms and the phylogenetic tree. In the next video, we're going to learn how we determine evolutionary relationships. Until then, this has been Dr. Sage.